mudar o esquema. Agora vou seguir pouco o texto e enfatizar o que eu acho que tem que ser enfatizado. This is my personal list of protagonists in the prison research arena. And one of my real great favorites, who impresses me most almost, is John Howard. Now why? Well, because he was traveling some 80,000 kilometers at a time when there were no airplanes and no buses, no cometa, and no things like that. So he traveled on horseback and on shoes 80,000 kilometers in the late 18th century. Now who would have thought that? And why did he do that? Well, he wanted to see some prisons. Isn't that remarkable? That is remarkable. And why did he want to see prisons? Because he wanted to improve prison conditions. And so he went, he died, by the way, in a place that is now in Ukraine. Why did he die in Ukraine? Because he caught some terrible prison disease. While he was doing research in Ukrainian prisons. But he has been everywhere. I mean, in Europe. And that's just, and his work on the state of the prisons in England, etc., is very big. Why is it very big? Because he gives detailed descriptions of how big the building is, where the rooms are, how big each room is, how it is organized, how hygiene is organized, water, food, how the wardens are, everything. Every detail he gives you on every prison at that time. And he published his work, easy to remember, in 1777. And that really was a historical event, because his book really influenced the discussion on the impossible state of prisons. What he wanted to say was, look people, look at these prisons, you have to look at them, and when you look at them you will see this is not the way to treat human beings. And we have to do something about it. And it was because of John Howard's book on the state of the prisons that people in England and in America started to engage in prison reform. And the invention of the Walnut Street prison in Philadelphia by the Quakers and their associates was one of the results of this book and this research. Now, he had not even had any contact with prisons in his life before, but then, after his wife had died, he went on a ship. Why did he go on a ship? Well, that was the time of the big earthquake in Lisbon. One of these events that had shaken the world and that had shaken a lot of people. Because such an earthquake had never happened in a European large city before, and that had destroyed Lisbon. And this had just not ever happened before. I mean, earthquakes had happened somewhere in the world, but not in big cities. And when that happened, people all over Europe were shaken to the bones. Many lost their faith because they thought, well, I had been thinking that God existed, but if God existed, he let something like this happen. then he is a cruel God, so I better believe that there is no God. And so that was a real crisis for the Christian faith, for philosophers. A lot of philosophy evolved. Immanuel Kant was somehow influenced by all this. So that was a big event. And when he learned that had been this earthquake in Lisbon, he happened to be quite wealthy. He took a lot of things and said, well, I want to go there and I want to see it and I want to help. But unfortunately, England, he had to pass France, and unfortunately England and France, it was like Germany and France, they had always been in war. This very evolutionarily beneficial intra-species, inter-group kind of conflict. So he was captured, the whole ship was captured, and he was brought to a fortress in Paris, and then they took him to another prison, and he spent some time in prison. And that is sometimes a good condition for people to become prison reformers. There has been a few years ago, not long ago, a very, very wealthy media tsar who was the owner of a lot of television networks in Great Britain and the United States, and he happened to own a number of newspapers too. And he was a very flamboyant person who thought that nobody could do anything to him. Suddenly he found himself in prison because of some financial problems or maneuvers. And the next thing he did was write a passionate book about how terrible the American criminal justice system is and how important and urgent it is to reform the prisons. So people say, what is a conservative? Well, a conservative is a liberal who has been mugged. And you could say, what is a prison reformer? A conservative that has been sent to prison. So he was one of these persons. He was rather well-to-do, rather wealthy, and had a lot of things to do in his life. But then he turned prison reformer, and he is not known for anything except for this book. And this book is until today, you cannot read it because it's so detailed and it's so long, and like sometimes they wrote at the end of the 18th century because there was nothing else to do. But he's a great guy. And this is why we will have a short look at him, John Howard. Very beautiful guy also. It's also from Crimpedia, and I made his picture very big because I like it so much. His prison travels. And I made this in bold with the 80,000 because I think I have only walked about maybe 100 kilometers in my life, and so that is great. Yeah, we have an English version and we have a little different German version.
In the Howard League they have the map exactly where he went.
Ah, do they?
Yeah, the Howard League from the Reform.
Yeah.
They have like historical session. They
Yeah.
have like exactly the first and the second.
Oh yeah, great, fantastic. Yeah, there is the Howard League for Penal Reform that is doing penal reform in his name, no wonder, because of his book. And there is, yeah, he's also done research on the principal lazarettos in Europe, hospitals, military hospitals, etc. So incredible. All right. Well, I can tell you, once I was in London, And I was invited by maybe at least there was a meeting in Westminster in the parliamentary building, and so I had a chance to talk about crime and things like that in the parliament there, and the group with some people from the House of Lords and some people from the other house. And in that context, I applied for membership, and you can have different memberships in the Howard League of Penal Reform. And I said, well, I want life membership. But I was very young at that time, and they agreed, which would mean I would get for all my life, I would get a free copy of their journal, which was quite nice, especially when you're young and have some time to go. It's a cheap subscription in a way.
It's subsidized.
Yeah, but they stopped sending.
Really?
But I never asked.
There should be proof of living.
Yeah, maybe that's what lacking. Okay, John Howard. Now you know how much I like him. Frank Tannenbaum is a big competitor because I also like him. And he was also an ex-prisoner. How did he become a prisoner? Well, he was fleeing, when he was something like 2 years old with his family, fleeing from Russia, or White Russia, because of the anti-Semitic pogroms. Like very many people, immigrants to the United States, they were fleeing from the violence that they had to endure in Eastern Europe. And the whole family came. Soon he fled from his family and to an uncle in New York City. And there he was in a bad neighborhood, which was very close to the modern school that was being established by Emma Goldman and her friend Bergman. The modern school was an atheistic, anarchistic modern school after the educational theory of Francisco Ferrer in Spain, who later was killed because he was so liberal and did not believe neither in kings nor in gods nor in saints. And that is very bad, at least was very bad in Spain at that time. And Emma Goldman, a famous anarchist, she was in New York City, and she had this modern school, and he was one of the good students there, and very good students. And when he was 18, he was already a leader of a group of unemployed people and of poor workers. He had become an anarchist agitator in New York City, and very few people know that he was somehow the first inventor of Occupy Wall Street, because his idea was, I go with my group of unemployed, hungry, homeless people, sin teto, sin nada. And what do? We go over the rich streets, the Fifth Avenue, we go over Broadway, and they were going exactly these streets, and then they would march and they would have their signs, we want shelter, we want food. And then they would go to these churches and they would ask for food and shelter in the churches. And most of the time the churches would give them something and say, oh, don't show your signs, cardboard signs so high, etc. But then they would get some food and shelter. But they also went to the churches where only the rich people went, a Broadway church, and occupied a Broadway church. And that turned out not so well. The police came, and I think it was his 18th birthday. He was arrested, and he was sentenced to prison. But he had a good show in court, and gave a good speech, and a reporter of the New York Times was present, and wrote what he was saying. And he said, well, you're going to send me for prison, or my colleagues for prison, because they just talk about their human rights, and you just don't want to give them their human rights. So it's sort of like propaganda sort of thing, but very well phrased. He must have learned a lot at the modern school. And he went to prison for 1 year on Roosevelt Island, which at that time had still another name. And I have visited all these places in honor of Frank Tannenbaum. And after a year he came out, and already after he had been sentenced, a rich lady from Manhattan, she had said, well, I've read this article and I've read what this young brave man has said in court as a defense, and I would like you, after your prison sentence, you can come to me. And she somehow gave him her address, or had somebody to give him her address. And indeed, they got in contact after his prison sentence, and she said, what do you want to do, young man, in your future life? And he said, well, I don't know, etc. And then he was accepted at Columbia University, well, at some university. And he got a scholarship from this rich lady, and so he was an ex-convict who was a good student. He was a fantastic school student. And then around 1922, everything was very fast. He wrote a book about prison wall shadows, and a little later he was a professor of criminology. He became a professor of criminology, but not for a long time, because in Mexico there was revolutionary stuff going on, and he was fascinated by that revolution. So he went to Mexico, talked with the president and with all sorts of revolutionaries, and he became what the New York Times called a Mexicologist. He was only a short time a criminologist, and then he became professor of Latin American studies and Mexico studies. And when he died in 1979, I think, 69, the New York Times said, Frank Tannenbaum, Mexicologist, dies age so much. So he was a good student, he was an ex-convict, and he was a writer about prisons, wall shadows. And he is usually only remembered for a book that he co-authored in 1938, Crime and the Community. That was a long time after he had been a criminologist. He had already turned Mexicologist for a long time, but crime was a big problem at that time, and people were remembering him and said, well, why don't you head a commission about how to solve youth gang crimes, etc., etc. And then what appeared was this big book, Crime in the Community, with contributions of 150 people, and also by him. And in that book, he talks about how the social reaction makes crime and makes people into criminals, from his own experience, but also sort of reflecting theoretically. And so he coined a very important phrase, which was the dramatization of evil. Even if we put somebody before the juvenile court and we want to have this person, we dramatize the stuff that he is doing, and we dramatize the bad things that he has been doing, and he is being labeled as criminal, if we want to or not, if we put him into this criminal process. So what really creates criminals is the labeling process of talking about his crimes all the time and making them official and putting him in prison, etc. And he gave a very good description of what you could call the interactionist approach that was later developed by people like Edwin Lemmert and Howard S. Becker and David Matza, etc. And also of the labeling approach. Labeling approach people, they tend to quote this dramatization of evil thing and a little bit of his things that he was writing about criminal careers. So, and I put a little quote in there that sort of reminds of the labeling perspective. And that was in 1938, that was rather early. So Frank Tannenbaum, also very high on my list. Now we have to speed up a little bit. Donald Clemmer, he invented the term prisonization, which nobody really knows what it is. It's sort of like the adaptation to the prison environment, and you have to change your behavior, and it's not necessarily the behavior that you need when you come out of prison. It's the behavior that you need when you're in prison. So the prisonization process is nothing that should be aspired to happen, but it happens. And it's one of the negative things that happen in prison. He then later coined a word, I found out, nobody told me, because it didn't catch on. He said, well, we have to stop the prisonization process. We have to make prisons in a way that people are being corrected in the prison, and they have to adapt to a situation in a good way. So we have to create a good situation so they can adapt to a good situation, and that would, I will call that correctionalization instead of prisonization. But nobody listened, and so nobody knows that this word exists. And as a matter of fact, I don't think very much correctionalization is happening. I don't know. Okay, Gresham Sykes, one of the first very good empirical, qualitative, modern style prison research things, study of a maximum security prison, society of captives. He was one of the first ones who let academic people know how prisons are being run, and that prisoners have an important role in running the prison. Now in Brazil, everybody knows that. And Sacha Dark, he has been writing about it also, and so people in Europe start knowing it too. James Jacobs, a very interesting guy. He's a little different from all the other ones. He's no anarchist. He's more conservative. But what he does in criminology, well, it's certainly not called critical criminology, but it's very solid and sometimes very surprising. And so I put his Stateville thing also. Peter Spierenburg, he tells us that much of what Foucault has been saying is not correct. Historically, historians are a little envious of Foucault, as we know, and they tend to correct him all the time. So, well, from a historic point of view, you are not a professional historian, etc. And he's also one of those, but he has really good points sometimes. And he's from Holland, and he's part of the Norbert Elias Foundation, and yeah, and he says, well, this idea with the birth of the prison, as Foucault describes, it's not quite, it's a little ideal type, sort of like, and historians don't like ideal types. They just want to know they want to know what happened. And he says, well, some things happened that don't fit so well in Foucault's thing. Loïc Vacan, of course, is a great prison investigator and theorist. And there's very, very much to his four-stage idea from slavery to mass imprisonment as a means to keep the dangerous classes under control. And that is very good. And then we have Michelle Alexander, of course, with her new, relatively new, but already classical study from slavery to mass incarceration, and the new Jim Crow, the new Jim Crow, mass incarceration and the age of colorblindness. Yeah. Sacha Dark, some of you may know him. He's doing, I think, very good stuff on Brazilian prisons and transporting it to the international audience, and very impressive. So. He's also been cited in my favorite article by Fernanda Mena in the Folia, the São Paulo. David Scott, senior lecturer at the Open University, he is a very critical person as far as prisons are concerned, and he has just published Against Imprisonment, not only imprisonment question mark, etc., but against imprisonment, and he will be one of the co-authors of a book that will appear shortly, hopefully this year, with contributions by Ricardo also, and a few colleagues from Italy and other places, which will be called No Prison. Okay. So this is getting very personal, all my likes. What I like, and not like. What I like. The Association for the Prevention of Torture, they're good people. The Global Prisons Research Network. The incarceration rate by country, of course, they're not good people, but it's like yesterday, the homicide list. This is another quite nice, very easily accessible list of countries by incarceration rate. And there we have one of these more or less useful lists. Let's put them in order. Now, 16 per 100,000 population in the Central African Republic. That's quite decent. 16 people per 100,000 in prison. Then we have a part of Denmark, the Faroe Islands. They are known in Europe. They are known because they have their own football team, and they are fun to play because there are only few people on this island. And in the qualification for the European Championship, you have a good chance when you're in the group of the Faroe to have a 10-0 result. Well, that always helps a little. Then we have the Guinea, even Congo, with only 29. That's not always a good sign, because you have had some 5 million dead in internal conflict over the last years in Congo. So they don't always bother to put you in prison. And during the long reign of Mobutu Sese Seko, that was decades, not a single new school was built, much less a new university or anything. So they didn't maybe build any new prison either, which is normally a good thing, but in this case, maybe not. India is a very interesting case. How come? India is such a big country, and they have 33 prisoners per 100,000 inhabitants. I have not done any in-depth research, even though there is a report that does some more research on it, which I read, but they don't really elucidate the question why they have a country. How can you run a big country like this with an imprisonment rate of 33? It's difficult to understand. Yeah, maybe people still believe in their caste system, and they follow informal rules that are so strict that the little enemy, maybe. Good hypothesis.
Yeah, if everybody has its place.
Yeah, and everybody believes, well, this is my place, this is where I belong.
We have social conformists.
Yeah. So there are these countries that have surprisingly little rates. As a matter of fact, in the 1970s, Holland, the Netherlands, they had a rate of 15. Now let's see where the Netherlands are today. We will find them somewhere. Here we have Norway, 70. They also had about half that. In the 1970s, they were hovering around 20, 30. Now they have 70. Germany, 78. Well, other statistics give other numbers. You don't have to trust the number by the one digit sort of thing. There are others that say 88. It always depends again on whatever. So Germany is between 78 and 88, I would say. Switzerland, 84. São Tomé e Príncipe, 87. Vanuatu, one of my favorite countries, but it's slowly drowning in the Pacific Ocean, 87. But they're trying to build the island a little higher. They take old tires and concrete and things, and so they might still be visitable in the next years. Now we come to the 100 threshold with Kosovo, Mayotte. Mayotte belongs to France. They are better off than the Comores, to which they belonged before. So the people from the Comores, they all come to Mayotte because it's French, it's very close. These islands north of Madagascar. And so the people from the independent Comores, who have their own money and their own poverty, they come to Mayotte, which have the euro, and they're subsidized, and they're part of France, and they're very close, and they just split because some wanted to be independent and some not. And when you want to be independent, you're punished. And now all these Comore people come to Mayotte, and there they are in prison. And this is why the Comores, they have a rate very low, as we have seen, and Mayotte has a low rate of 100. But it's Comores people who are not so much liked because they're so poor. Haiti has, I've seen a documentary about Haiti prisons. We don't have the time to show it, but that's impressive. That's a reporter who goes into a prison in Haiti, and he talks with different people, with a lot of people. And a lot of people say, well, I'm on pre-trial here. And they have a very high pre-trial rate in prison. Now, this is not uncommon in many countries, but there are very many. There are countries in which 80% of the people are pre-trial detainees. And then there are people who have been absolved. They have had their trial. And the judge said, you're innocent. But then it takes a while, it can take a year, until this decision is being implemented, because you're sitting in prison and the judge is sitting somewhere else. And the judge has to write, and the judges don't always write in the very evening that they give the sentence, and their employees are not always there to write. So things can get lost, and maybe there's a signature lacking. And he found people who really had been absolved a year ago, and they were still in prison. And he said, well, let me try. I'm a reporter, but I will work with an international organization. We'll try to get you out. And well, that took a long time, but then it did work. And you can see the Minister of Justice or somebody very important signing a document. Of course, there were all sorts of cameras and so on. So, but the other people, they were all staying there. It was only that they got out this guy. This is a very impressive document. You have that in many countries. Kafkaesque. I mean, you're either in pre-trial and you've been there for 5 years or 8 years in pre-trial for nothing. Maybe Uma Berinjela, there was a case in Italy where somebody had stolen a berinjela, an aubergine. And it took some years, and then the High Court said, no, he can't get out. And he was even you get indemnization. But things can happen, and in many parts, the prison is not for the dangerous people. The prison is. Você tem exemplo aqui com bolachas, né? É. Então, pode acontecer em todo que é país. So, okay, I'm losing myself in Haiti, Haiti, Noaki. Okay, we have the 100 threshold. Let's get a little further down. Well, so one can study a whole lot of things. It's a very inspiring list. And then finally, you remember we have had 18 in the beginning of the list. Now we come to Guam, United States, a little island, 469. Cuba, a bigger island, which does not belong completely to the United States yet, 510. El Salvador, 541. Virgin Islands, holiday paradise for honeymooners, 542. This, a few years ago, these numbers didn't exist. In no country there were 542 per 100,000. This is a new development. It's because the prison is such a great invention. It's a big success, you know, especially on the Virgin Islands and in Turkmenistan, where you have the Turkmenbashi. The Turkmenbashi is the chief of Turkmenistan. I don't know if they have elections, but they do have the Turkmenbashi and his family. And one beautiful, now the real Turkmen, it's like North Korea, the real Turkmenbashi has died, unfortunately.